Hi everybody, welcome back to the Claremont Classic Garage. I know I already made one video about converting this old Fordson to a battery ignition, but I really didn't like it. It was kind of evolving as I did it, and it ended up being a dog's breakfast with hunks of spacers, and the distributor was flopping all over like this when it was running. So at least I know the thing runs. So I took it all apart and I started with a blank sheet of paper and I completely reimagined the whole thing, and I'm going to show you what I did. So here's all the stuff we're going to need to do this distributor conversion part 2. So I'm going to get started and I'll kind of show you each piece as I put it on. Okay, first step, we're going to mount our gearbox. And as I showed you before, this is a 2-to-1 or 1-to-2 gearbox from Sears Craftsman. And how we're going to drive this thing is with 2 sockets, a 5/8 and a 1/2 inch, joined together with a piece of 3/8 square rod, and it's going to get driven off that nut inside there that holds the governor to the drive gear. And that's fine because it turns the right way that it won't loosen in motion. So that's going to end up in there like that. So we mount it to this bracket, and this is our seal. There's our gearbox all mounted. Now what we're going to put in is the valve cover with our distributor mounting bracket. Here's the bracket we made that actually holds the distributor. We just made it out of a piece of metal we had kicking around, and it's bolted to the side cover. And there was a little trial and error involved in making this, let me tell you. Okay, so there's that installed on there. It's a little springy, but we'll fix that, don't worry. Up until now, this was basically the same as I had it before. The problem before is when it was running, the distributor would be flopping all over the place because just the way I ended up having to mount it. This bracket theoretically should have been up here, but the manifold's in the way, so I had to mount the bracket low. Anyway, I'll show you what I came up with to solve the problem. First, I've got this. It's made out of a piece of fence pipe, a washer, and a piece of exhaust pipe. Gotta do what you gotta do. It goes on there like that. Then we drop in our drive elements, which is that socket and this socket. Get them engaged. There we go. I like to get a 12-point socket in there where I can because it gives me a little more versatility in getting the actual timing set. Now, our distributor drops down inside this piece of, that's another piece of fence pipe. And we tighten these 2 set screws. I had to make this 2 or 3 times too before I got it in a good place. There. Okay, now the engine right now is at number 1, top dead center, firing. So our rotor will need to be like that, pointing at number 1 on the cap. So we'll just drop it in and fiddle around with it till we get it in the right place. And if you don't remember from our previous video, this distributor is a Delco unit. It came out of an American-built TO20 Ferguson. I would have loved to use a Lucas distributor from an English-built TE Ferguson, but they turned the wrong way. Too bad, so we'll use this. Now that goes in and slides over the other pipe. Yeah, we're off a tooth. Let me try and move it 1 flat on the socket. Put it back where it was. Oh, that's pretty good. Perfect. Okay, so once that's in there, now we can bolt this side up. So here's our finished installation. It looks good and it's pretty darn solid. I add this bracket here to tie this plate down to all this stuff down here, and it's not going anywhere. So what I've got to do next is lay in the primary wiring for the ignition and the coil. And then we'll do the secondary wiring, and we should be ready to fire it up. Here's a little bracket I made to hold our ignition coil. And lastly, here's a little timing pointer that I made so I can get in there with the timing light theoretically and see what we've got. I don't know what it's supposed to be at. Probably around 30 degrees total, I would guess. Now, I got to look at some pictures and see if I can figure out exactly where the primary wiring, I'm not sure if it comes through this tube or if it has its own tube along the engine. We'll figure that out. I've got my primary ignition circuit complete. I decided to just run it in a piece of flexible loom. That's fine. So the power to the coil comes through a ballast resistor and back to the ignition switch. It does look a little sloppy up here because what I want to do is find at some point the original electrical box that sits up on here on top of the steering column. So I just want to leave myself enough wire that I can get that all hooked up. But for now, in this area, we're basically done. So next step, I'm going to lay in the high tension leads. Now we've got our secondary ignition wiring done, or high tension leads, whatever you want to call them, spark plug wires. Everybody's got a different name for them. So I guess it's time now to crank this thing up and see if we can get it tuned up. So we got our timing light out and we've set it to 30 degrees total, which should be pretty good. I got to adjust the clutch. Got a real lope to it at idle, I'll say, but I had it out for a field test and the governor is working a lot better now. It's certainly livable. There is a few little issues with it, wearing these shafts and whatnot that are just gonna make it impossible to ever get it perfect, but it's pretty darn good now. Our ignition seems to be a hit. I'm happy with it, but I did find one problem. Between two sockets held together, two other sockets held together, and this gearbox here, we've got a lot of play. First thing I'm going to do is try and tighten up some of the slop in the driveline for this distributor. So we've got lots of places where there's play. Number one, the joints where I've got these two sets of sockets joined together, there's play there, especially on this one. There's a lot of play. This old 12-point socket that I was using to drive the distributor is pretty worn out. So I'm going to swap it out for this 6-point one. It'll cost me a little adjustability as far as clocking it, but we'll have to work around that. And I have to make sure that I set this up correctly. I have to make sure I take up that end play, because when that's out like that sloppy, it puts a lot of lash in the gear. When it's pushed in tight, there's not so much lash. So we're going to work on that. I put a few center punches on this and that'll help tighten it up. A lot of that play is gone, so now we can reassemble the gear train. Alright, that's better. I can feel now I've taken all that excess play out of the drive line. That was probably causing the timing to bounce around quite a bit at idle. So we're just going to keep picking away. I would really like to take this distributor apart. I'm just not sure how this has all been done down here. I'd like to get the advanced mechanism out of it and have a look at a couple of things. It seems to be a little sticky returning back to zero. You can see here where there's a pin in there that's peened over, so I'm going to try and file the peen off and knock it out. Got it. Now the next question is that welded to the shaft? We're about to find out. And the answer was no. Now we can pull this distributor apart. So here's something that was made to last. A nice cast iron distributor. I like that. Now let's talk about the advanced mechanism. First thing I see that's a problem is it doesn't return right back to zero. You see that? So that's when it's sitting there, you're losing, I'd say, at least a third of it, which is going to affect where you can set the initial timing and how much total advance you get. So we're going to have to take this thing apart and see if there's something that's causing this problem. The problem may just be wear. Another thing I have to deal with is these here springs. So this tractor, the maximum RPM of the engine is 1200, 1200. That is it. The engine that this came out of, the maximum RPM was 2200 RPM, 1000 more. So I doubt that thing is even turning fast enough. I noticed, I think on my timing light I was getting about 5 degrees out of it, which is nothing. So we're going to try and deal with that too at the same time. First I want to get this thing apart and see why it's not returning. First thing we're going to do is give everything a good cleaning. So I've got everything all cleaned up now. And you can see the advanced mechanism. The springs are just wiped out. They don't pull it back to zero anymore. So we're going to have to do some experimenting and see what we can come up with. I was able to give this big spring a little tweak and get it working again. It pulls it right back to zero and lets it advance fully. And then what I did is I replaced the second heavy spring with a super light one, like we used to do in the cars. So we'll put this in and see how that works. This thing also had way too much end play. So I'm going to put an extra washer there. And that'll nip that in the bud. There we go. Now you can put our retainer on. And put our pin back in. Now we can knock our pin back over and kind of peen it up a bit on the ends. Good, now we can put the breaker plate back in and get this thing back together. Now that's what you like to see stamped in the back of your points. Points on this are set to 22 thousandths. It's a tiny bit tight there. It's not so easy to set up because somewhere along the line the cam screw has gotten misplaced. So we do this by trial and error. We've got our engine sitting at top dead center ready to fire on number 1. And we've got our rotor pointing right at number 1 on the cap. So we can tighten everything up now and we should be pretty close for getting this thing started. Alright, well there it is. It's up and running on the distributor. Beautiful. Ferguson parts can save an old Fordson, I guess. Anyway, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this debacle. And until next time, this is Kevin checking out from the Claremont Classic Garage. Thanks and so long.